Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming to this event, which is called Affect and the Arab Spring. The event will basically have two parts. The first of them will be a lecture by our guest, Dr. Ty Solomon of the University of Glasgow, on ontological security, circulations of affect, and the Arab Spring. This will be followed by a discussion, which will be initiated by our discussant, my colleague Jan Daniel, a researcher here at the Institute of International Relations. I think we could barely have a better discussant because Jan is actually well versed both in the theory aspect, which will be most of the presentation, and the empirical issues, because he's been working on both international political sociology and the Middle East, in particular Lebanon. Let me introduce Ty, who was very kind to accept our invitation, and it's my real pleasure that we can have him here. Ty is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Glasgow. Before that, he worked at the University of South Florida and the University of Florida. Is there a University of North Florida as well somewhere?
I don't think there's a North Florida.
Okay, so basically all the Florida
all
universities.
The Floridas, yeah.
Despite being only a few years from his PhD, he's already been widely published by journals like International Studies Quarterly, European Journal of International Relations, Cooperation and Conflict, Millennium, and others. His work until now has been summarized in his last year's book, The Politics of Subjectivity in American Foreign Policy Discourses, which is also available from the library here. Ty works on a number of issues in international relations and social theory, broadly defined, such as discourse, identity, affect, and emotion, which will be today the main topic of that. Apart from that, he's unpacked these ideas in the context of American foreign policy, neoconservatism, weapons of mass destructions, and now, newly, in the context of the Arab Spring. Without any further ado, I'll hand the floor to Ty, who will be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to discussion, which will also last about 45 minutes, so I think there will be plenty of space for everyone interested to ask their question. First of all, I'd like to ask you to join me in a round of applause for Ty.
Well, thank you, Jakub, for that very kind introduction. I should have you do all my introductions, including my class sessions, introducing me to my class. So, thank you all for having me. It's really an honor to be here to speak with you tonight and tomorrow also. So, I guess just a bit of background on this paper. So the paper is, the title of the talk is Affect in the Arab Spring, but the title of the paper is actually Ontological Security, Circulations of Affect in the Arab Spring. And this is a paper that's actually now forthcoming, so it should be out the next year, hopefully, but hopefully online sooner. I'd be happy to send you a copy if you're interested. This paper is going to be part of a special issue of Journal of International Relations and Development on ontological security. So this article is part of a larger group of articles making up a special issue. So, and where this paper came from is that I was interested in or grappling with ideas about collective affect, and then I was invited to contribute to a special issue on the topic of ontological security. So I tried to merge these two interests of mine together, and I'm still working out how well they work together. So I'm very much, even though the paper is forthcoming, I'm still working through these ideas. So I'm very much interested in what you all have to say and what you have to think about what I've tried to do here. So, so what I want to do today, perfect. So what I want to do is basically lay out the question that I'm interested in this paper, the puzzle that I think is here. Then walk through the theoretical or conceptual framework that I've tried to develop to tackle the question, and then move on to, in the third part, talking about how I've tried to use the Arab Spring protests as an empirical case or empirical illustration of the theoretical framework I've developed. And so I should note here at the beginning that even though the paper is on sort of ostensibly on the Arab Spring, I'm not a Middle East expert. Most of my interests are mostly in IIR theory, security studies, and U.S. foreign policy is where I've done most of my writing. And so this is a new empirical area for me. And so, again, it'd be helpful to hear someone who actually studies the Arab Spring is what they do to let me know if this makes sense from the empirical perspective, whereas I'm coming at it from more the theoretical perspective, right? And so broadly what I want to do here is focus less on the specific politics of the Arab Spring and more on what the complexities of the Arab Spring can tell us about how IR goes about studying affect and ontological security is really what I'm trying to do in the paper. So to start off, I guess the question or the thing that got me interested in this topic is basically news and media coverage of the Arab Spring, right? So we all remember the news coverage of it, and one of the prominent things that came out of news coverage of the Arab Spring, at least in the States and the UK context that I'm most familiar with, is the sheer frequency of movement metaphors to describe what went on, right? And here we all remember headlines of winds of change or ripples of change rippling across the region, and these sorts of metaphors, and they were ubiquitous across particularly American reporting on the Arab Spring. So these movement metaphors were really used to describe the protests quite a bit, and at this point it probably borders on cliche to keep talking about the Arab Spring in terms of winds of change, particularly given what's happened since then, particularly in Egypt. And so in addition to that, I was interested in how IR scholars have gone about explaining the Arab Spring, and there seem to be two themes in the literature on it, right? And these revolve around focusing obviously on the political and economic grievances that people had toward the regimes that they're protesting, and also, secondly, the role of social media in explaining kind of the sparking and the spread of the uprisings, right? So here you see lots of studies on the role of Twitter, on the role of Facebook, the role of Al Jazeera and satellite news of broadcasting images around the region, helping to spark and spread the protests, right? So you have the academic literature that focuses on this. You have the media coverage that uses winds of change metaphors to describe what was going on. I thought there's actually something interesting here, right? So even though it is sort of cliche to describe the protests in these terms, it does seem to get at something that the academic literature, for the most part, hasn't gotten to, right? So there is, if we've seen the clips and watched the news and watched the documentaries about the sheer visceral, embodied nature of the protests, right? And this is something I got really interested in. I'm interested in sort of micro-political dimensions of international relations, notions of rhythm and notions of how the body is political, notions of emotions. And so I thought, or actually discovered that in the IR literature on the Arab Spring, the emotional and affective dimensions of the protests have gone somewhat surprisingly overlooked, right? And so what I want to do in this paper is to try to see what ontological security as a framework and what affect perspectives can tell us or highlight about the Arab Spring uprisings that the current academic literature doesn't tell us, right? So I want to talk about emotion where no one else is talking about emotion, essentially, is what I want to do in the paper, right? So what I want to do is talk about the two bodies of literature that I'm interested in, ontological security and emotion, then move on to how I think they need to be fixed in order to tackle something like the Arab Spring. And again, all this is within the context of international relations. So I realize that social movement scholars talk a bit more about emotion than I'm leading on to here, so I'm kind of glossing over a lot of that, but it's something I'm digging into at the moment. So mostly I'm focused on critiquing international relations specifically. So ontological security is a framework that is focused on security, which is what a lot of IR scholars focus on, but it's not focused on physical security, right? So realist perspectives, strategic perspectives focus on security in a very physical sense, obviously, right? So focus on the security of the territory of the nation, security of the body, of the population. Ontological security takes a very different tack to that. And what ontological security scholars argue is that human beings need, by extension states, need not just physical security of the body, but they need security of the self, right? Secure senses of self in order to proceed with agency, basically. So two prominent scholars in this literature, Jennifer Mitzen and Brent Steele have both written a lot on ontological security. And they basically argue that before we can have a sense of agency, before we can go about acting in the world, we need to have a consistent sense of self, or a secure sense of self, in addition to our bodily security, right? And so this is drawn from essentially psychoanalytic perspectives, where Giddens and R.D. Laing first talked about this, and Mitzen and Steele and others try to extrapolate this up to states. Right? So, and Mitzen's way of doing this is to kind of reread the security dilemma. So her 2006 article in European Journal of International Relations, which basically sparked this literature, she looks at the security dilemma and specific security dilemmas such as Palestinian-Arab conflict or Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and she tries to show that we can make sense of long-term conflicts if we look at them in terms of how they actually bring a sense of identity stability to the participants. Right? And so she uses to explain things that we would otherwise question why they're still going on. Right? So conflicts, as much damage as they can bring, can actually bring a secure sense of self or help bring a coherent identity to the participants. Right? So the thing I want to question about this literature is its focus on actors or subjects. And that might seem a little strange at first because, of course, we need to focus on actors and subjects if we're trying to explain their behavior. But what I want to argue is that there's more that matters to senses and feelings of agency other than just focusing on actors themselves. Actors operate within a broader social context, a broader affective milieu, if you will. And I think if we were to refocus ontological security to looking at these broader cultural, affective environments, we might get a better handle on how security-seeking subjects sort of emerge from those contexts, right? So I want to look at, I don't want to dismiss the actors, but I want to look at the broader context within which they sort of emerge. And that'll become clear, I hope, in a few minutes, right? So the broader feelings, bring in the broader feelings, moods, and charged political atmospheres in the Arab uprisings that I think helped to condition the kinds of political subjects and identities that emerged in those protests. Right? So that's ontological security. That's sort of what it is and what I think is wrong with it. Oh, thanks, Jakub. So if we want to turn to emotions in IIR, this is the other body of literature that I want to work with here. Now, IIR has done a pretty good job the last 10 or 15 years of saying essentially emotions matter now, right? So IIR isn't just seen anymore as a rational game played by nation states. A lot of scholars, Nita Crawford, Jonathan Mercer, Karin Fierke, a lot of scholars are starting to look at emotions and say emotions are really important for trying to explain lots of things that we want to explain in international relations. Andrew Ross, also I should flag up his book there, really, really good book. So two aspects of this literature I want to address specifically, right? So there's two themes in this literature that I think are important to highlight. One is the focus on state-level emotions. Okay? The other is the focus on discrete emotional categories, right? So first of all, state emotions. And so a lot of the way IIR scholars have gone about looking at emotions is maybe naturally to look at how states experience emotion, right? So scholars like Brent Sassley and Todd Hall have written work on how states aren't merely rational actors doing constant cost-benefit calculations, but states also in a way experience emotions, whether that's through state leaders projecting emotion or performing emotion on the world stage, or if we think about states as amalgamations of social groups that experience emotion. IIR folks are trying to think about how states might have emotions, sort of moving beyond the rationalist and constructivist normal frameworks we use to analyze state behavior. Right? So in a lot of ways, the emotions literature is a way to try to move beyond the sort of impasses of rationalist and constructivist frameworks. So one thing about the focus on state-level emotions is that it sort of mirrors the focus in ontological security on subjects. right? So focus on states or any type of collective agent, any type of collective actor, tends to downplay implicitly or explicitly the affective environments or contexts or milieus within which those subjects or actors act or operate. Right? So that's one shortcoming of focusing on agents or states with state-level emotions. And second, the notion of emotion categories. Right? So a lot of the emotions work is focused on the role of specific emotions in specific contexts, right? So fear, humiliation, shame sometimes. These are examples of specific emotions that IIR scholars have started to look at to say, hey, this specific emotion matters in this context, therefore we should start looking at a lot more emotions in IIR. So, and all that work is really excellent, but one thing it, again, sort of downplays are the things that don't fall neatly into emotion categories, right? So there are lots of different kinds of emotional experiences that don't fall neatly within things you could label as fear or shame or humiliation. They're experiences that are less articulable but still matter to how we act as human beings, right? So, and we can talk about things such as moods here. Moods can be political, I'm going to claim. Things like atmospheres, right, which I'll mention in a minute, I think can be political. And so these less defined types of emotional experiences still matter politically, I think, but they don't always fall into neat emotion categories as the literature sort of has gotten into, right? So those are some of the shortcomings, I think, of the way the emotions literature in IIR has come about the last 10 years or so, right? So, and what I'm interested in here is the notion of transpersonal affects or emotions, right, that extend across or exceed individuals, right? So basically the way IIR usually looks at emotions is through kind of political psychology frameworks that focuses on egos or individual subjects. I'm interested more in the kinds of emotional experiences that are intrinsically collective, feeling the atmosphere of a room, which we've all felt before, or feeling the atmosphere of a protest or a rally, something like this most of us have probably felt. There are kinds of emotional experiences that exceed the subject or exceed individuals. I think those things mattered in the Arab Spring, right? So it's often out of these affective backgrounds that subjects coalesce, their identities come together, and from which identifiable emotions become distilled and crystallized. So out of these sort of vague, inarticulable, affective moods and atmospheres, we get funneled down much more defined and concrete emotional experiences, right? And part of my understanding here comes from our interest in psychoanalysis and what these theories can tell us about how human beings work. And often in these types of literatures, you hear patients essentially talking about how they're in a mood, and a few days later they kind of realize what kind of a funk they were in a few days ago. So only later they attach a specific meaningful signifier to something they experienced earlier. That's a bit of a tangent, but I'll move on. So essentially, if you take how, thanks, I keep forgetting that. So if you take how IIR talks about ontological security and emotions, the parameters within which those literatures operate, I think, make it difficult to grapple with something like the Arab Spring. So it doesn't really, IIR doesn't do a good job through these literatures of talking about the kinds of experiences and movements that we saw in the Arab Spring. It doesn't do a good job of telling us how and why the protests moved across borders and across regions and across nations. It doesn't tell us very much about how particular types of experiences were contagious across cities, towns, regions, and borders, right? I think if we start to dig more deeply into these kinds of affective experiences, we in IIR can actually say something interesting about the movements of affective or emotional contagion that were undeniably, I think, part of the protests, right? So we need a new way to think about the intersections between ontological security and affect if we're going to make sense of events like the Arab Spring. So my entry point into this is to draw upon a wide range of literatures that talk about affect in these particular ways, basically contagious affect, right? So the notion, the concept of circulations of affect, this is a phrase that the philosopher Deleuze uses in some of his work, and particularly I'm thinking of 1,000 Plateaus here. He and Guattari use this phrase to talk about affect as something that's inherently and intrinsically relational, right? So in contrast to the way we talk about political psychology in IIR, so I'm thinking of Rose McDermott here is one of my foils. The way she talks about emotion is very individualistic, a very kind of ego-based. Emotion is something that individuals experience that others can't experience, and others can't experience how you feel, right, from an individual perspective, and there's certainly something to that. We all have individual emotions that no one else can feel, but there are also other times where you do get a kind of shared affect across individuals. And you see this in political rallies, and my attention the last 48 hours has been on the kinds of circulations. I've felt circulations of affect the last 48 hours, as you all might have, that I think stretched across individuals. And so I think this is quite political. I think we should dig more deeply into this. So I use Deleuze as a way into this. And Deleuze looks at affect as something that is, again, inherently, intrinsically relational. Right? He doesn't deny that individuals have experiences that are unique to them, but he also doesn't deny that, or he starts from the point that affects can be shared in a way across individuals. Right? And so this is picked up in disciplines such as human geography. Folks like Nigel Thrift and Ben Anderson talk about how affect can be shared, even if loosely, across groups and crowds of people. People like William Connolly in political theory use Deleuze's ideas about collective affect to talk about sort of contemporary politics. And so the way Deleuze talks about this is, of course, the question is how do you get at this? The way he talks about it is in terms of the role of the body and embodiment. Right? So for Deleuze, the body is almost inherently, intrinsically political because it's intrinsically relational. Right? So Deleuze makes a striking claim, and Andrew Ross makes this claim in his book on mixed emotions, that bodies aren't intrinsically individual. Right? We're always caught up in collective nets and webs of meaning and social relations. So Deleuze starts from the point that our body, even our bodies, the things that we think of as uniquely ours and uniquely individual, are not from the start uniquely ours or individual, because everything we do is caught up in signification and meaning and social structures and all the rest, right? From the way we're treated as infants to the clothes that we wear and the food that we eat is all shaped by tattoos. Everything we do is basically shaped by social interactions, right? So, and Deleuze talks about this, the role of the body in terms of assemblages, right? So, other folks in IIR picked up on this in actor network theory, and folks who follow Latour use the concept of assemblage as a way of talking about kinds of collective structures that don't have a fixed origin, but yet come together to have particular effects, then dissolve and come together again in different sorts of ways. Right? And so an example of this is how William Connolly uses Deleuze and assemblages to talk about the American conservative movement. Right? So Connolly has this really neat analysis in his 2008 book where he talks about the American right, not just in terms of sort of neoliberal economics, but it's a particular amalgamation of neoliberal economics, particular forms of American nationalism, particular racial beliefs mixed in, militarism, a particular media environment, Fox News. So the American right is all these things sort of put together, but in no structured, concrete way that has particular effects. And so for Connolly, it's these kinds of assemblages that generate and maintain affective links across individuals, right? And so this is how Deleuze, and people who follow Deleuze in philosophy and geography and other fields, cultural studies, talk about affect, and not in terms of specific emotions such as fear, humiliation, or what have you, but talk about affect more in terms of resonances and intensities, right? So they talk about these, they try to get at these kinds of experiences that are very intense, but it's hard to articulate or put quite into words what you're experiencing. So if you, some of the people I read that experienced the Arab Spring, first-hand accounts, sort of talk about their experiences in this way. They talk about how they were in Tahrir Square, for example, or the main squares in Tunisia, and they talk about these kinds of experiences they had being groups of other people, but yet they didn't attach a specific word or emotion to their experience. And so I think, my claim is anyway, that Deleuze and Conley are sort of onto something when they talk about emotions in these terms of resonances and intensities, right? So I just put up one quote from an Egyptian here. If you're interested, the quote, the citations in the paper. So one Egyptian, I think they were in Alexandria actually, said there was a raised collective consciousness among us, right? So a realization, an epiphany. We drew strength, courage, and resolve from one another from our numbers, right? So you see lots of types of testimonies like this from people who participated in the protests. And so I think that's really interesting. So a second concept I use to try to get at this notion of collective affect is affective atmospheres, right? So again, we've all felt the notion of walking into a room and feeling atmosphere, walking into a talk or walking into a class that maybe the students seem particularly low energy on some days. It's getting toward the end of the UK semester, so my students are getting particularly low energy at this point in the semester, as are most of my colleagues. But we all know this feeling of walking into a room and feeling an atmosphere. And folks like Ben Anderson in geography try to extend this to broader collective phenomena. And he's interested in this because it gets at these types of experiences that, again, don't fall within neat categories, right? So Anderson has a really neat discussion of how affective atmospheres seem to matter in lots of different ways for shaping our experiences and even shaping our subjectivities and our identities. But they don't fall into normal binaries that we usually use to talk about social identities, for example. So affective atmospheres are neither present nor absent, right? So you can feel the atmosphere of a room, but it's not anything you can put your finger on and touch. It's neither individual nor collective. It's sort of both and neither at the same time. One can feel an atmosphere of a room, but it's not located within any one individual. By definition, it's collective, but yet individuals can still feel an atmosphere in different and individual ways. So it's neither, but also both individual and collective. It's subjective and objective, both at the same time, right? So subjects feel it. And you ask everyone in the room if they feel an atmosphere, and they might say yes, and it's got some sort of traditional objective existence, but they might feel it differently. Neither definite nor indefinite, so you kind of get the picture of how atmospheres are kind of a collective experience which defy the normal schematics that we usually try to graft onto these experiences. And Anderson describes them in terms of atmospheres that occur beyond, alongside, and belong, beyond, around, and alongside the formation of subjectivity. So it's often within these sort of rich and dense affective and emotional contexts that people's identities are shaped, and even new identities emerge, right? Which is something IR doesn't talk about all that much, right? So we usually talk about in IR of identities being reflections of self and other, and mutual constitution of self and other, and that's true in a lot of cases. But in other cases, you see new kinds of subjectivities and identities emerge from these kinds of kind of intense affective and emotional experiences. So I want to try to use these concepts of collective affect to rethink ontological security in international relations, right? So one of the main arguments of ontological security work is that agents need stable senses of self or stable self-narratives in order to act. States need consistent biographies in order to sort of make sense of their world. The U.S. tells itself myths about exceptionalism and all the rest in order to have a sense of agency, or its leaders have a sense of agency. Most countries, all countries probably do this. So agency requires a cognitively stable environment in order to act. But if we look at what happened in these protests, that's not necessarily true, right? So the people who protested, places like Tunisia, Egypt, and around the region, faced significant insecurity when they went out to protest. And most of them were under no illusions about what they were going to face when they were facing down the state apparatus, essentially, state security services. So they knew that really bad things could happen, and really bad things did happen to some of them. And they knew that they didn't know what was going to happen, right? So you see people having agency in senses where the literature tells us that they shouldn't have agency, right? Very cognitively uncertain contexts leading to very strong senses of agency. I want to say the way we bridge that chasm is through bringing in concepts of collective affect. And collective affect can jump over that chasm between a cognitively unstable environment, such as the social foundations of a regime being shaken, to people feeling that they have the strength and agency able to do that, right? So circulations of affect and affective atmospheres help to bring about new understandings or new hopes of ontological security despite the insecurity they were facing, which is not what the literature tells us we should be expecting. So it's just a couple of quotes to illustrate, I remember that one. Just a couple of quotes to illustrate what I'm talking about here. So, and all these quotes are from the paper. These were kind of compiled these from news accounts. There's a couple of edited volumes of people who basically just wrote essays on their experiences in the Arab Spring. And so I'm drawing this secondhand, obviously. So Tahrir Square was like heaven. It was how you wanted Egypt to be, right? This was a person, Tahrir Square, obviously. Tahrir is the most exhilarating place in the world. This was actually a quote from, I forgot that time. This was from Nicholas Kristof, who was a New York Times reporter who spent a few days in Tahrir Square, and he, coming up from a very particular Western perspective, but he sort of articulated the same sort of experience that Egyptians themselves articulated in terms of the kinds of things they felt being there amongst other bodies and other participants in the space of the square, right? So feelings of ontological insecurity, right, were met with senses of security stemming from the affective dynamics of the events. And again, this isn't something we should expect given what the ontological security literature says, right? So literature says people need stable cognitive environments to have stable self-narratives in order to act. But in this case, we see very disrupted social context, very disrupted biological narratives. That people's identities were sort of changing along with their performances and their participation in the protest. And so I think something really interesting here is going on, and affect is the key missing ingredient, if you will. Right? So this is another quote from a person in either Alexandria or Cairo. Then the most incredible thing happened, this male participant said. The riot police turned back and started running for their lives. We all knew that something profound had just taken place. Right? There was a raised collective consciousness among us, a realization, an epiphany, he says. We drew strength, courage, and resolve from one another, from our numbers. So you see this quite a bit. People talking about the sheer bodily, visceral context within which they're acting and performing and operating, adding to their feelings of that they could change things, right? So there's another account or a quote from in the paper of a woman. She talks about how she was reluctant to protest at first, but she was watching a protest march by on her street one day, and she says she was watching them, and she says before she knew it, she was carried along to march with them. And before she knew it, she was in Tahrir Square protesting along with them. She was, her fist was pumping, and she was shouting the protest slogans. And she was sort of surprised that she was doing this, because she didn't really decide or calculate to participate, but she just sort of got swept along with the crowd, so to speak. And so you see accounts like this, which I think are really interesting in terms of the affective and embodied, it's just sheer visceral experience, what that can tell us about what's going on in these spaces. So then the paper has some more examples of this, and I go through, basically use several folks. So I use Deleuze here. I use Sarah Ahmed's work on affective economies. So Sarah Ahmed wrote what's become a very cited book on cultural politics of emotions, and she talks about notions of collective affects that get stuck to words and phrases, right? So signifiers, words and phrases like revolution spread across multiple countries, carried with it affect the more it was repeated and circulated. When the protests in Egypt first started up, Egyptians started chanting Tunisia, Tunisia, right? And so for them, this wasn't obviously a neutral geographic descriptor, right? They weren't shouting Tunisia because it was, they weren't just referring to the territory of Tunisia, they were referring to what that term meant for them there in Egypt, having just watched what went on in Tunisia. So these signifiers, revolution, Tunisia, circulated, and Sarah Ahmed has this nice formulation where she says that signs are sticky, and they have sticky associations, meaning the more they circulate, the more affective they become. Right? And you sort of saw this in the Arab Spring. The more people chanted, and there was a lot of chanting, which is really interesting in terms of its sort of, again, its rhythmic, embodied, affective, temporal dimensions. But the more people chanted things like, across the region, things like revolution, and people want the overthrow of the regime in Tunisia, and so forth and so on, Ahmed explains this in terms of basically economies or circulations of affect. The more these things get repeated and chanted, the more energy they sort of carry with them, and the more they help to shape people's identities and senses of agency as they're performing the chants and the signifiers, the significations themselves, right? So there's a really interesting mix we see here between not just discourse, it is discourse, but it's not only discourse, between identities and subjectivities. It is those things, but they're discursive and embodied at the same time. The space of the protest, right? So there's some really good work in geography on the sheer space of places like Tahrir Square and the streets that dictated how the protests basically came about, which I haven't talked about much here, but there's really good work on that. So there's really interesting stuff going on about looking at affects and emotions and people's charged senses of agency through these assemblages of bodies and affect and space and rhythm and temporality, rhythm as temporality, we might say, which I think IIR should look at. And in this particular case, I think it tells us something interesting about what the ontological security literature tells us we should expect, but we don't in this case. I think affect, again, is the missing ingredient here. So just to close with something Deleuze says, again, this is in Thousand Plateaus if you're a Deleuze fan, affects go beyond the strength of those who undergo them, which is sort of a cryptic way of saying affects aren't just individualistic, right? So affects, people have their own individual feelings, but affects are oftentimes intrinsically relational and therefore political and collective, right? So affects weren't simply epiphenomenal to the protests, I want to argue, or at least suggest, but rather were paramount in the production of new ontological security-seeking subjectivities, identities, right? So it's not the case that Twitter did all the work. I'm glossing a lot here, but it's not just the case that it was only social media. It's not just the case that it was only satellite TV or political and economic grievances. I think there's a case to be made that affect is doing independent, explanatory work here that we haven't looked at yet. Right? That's my claim anyway. So, and the thing I think is really interesting here is that it shaped new capacities for agency. Right? So IIR talks a lot about agents and structures. This is an aspect of agency that we haven't talked much about yet, how affect and emotions can bring about senses of agency that weren't there before, right? So the woman who felt herself carried along without really realizing she got pulled into the crowd, is those senses of agency I think are really interesting that IIR doesn't talk much about, and we probably should. Right? So just to wrap up, so IIR I think needs to pay more attention to collective affective experience, and in the last 10 years, folks are starting to pay more attention to affects and emotions, but I think we're just barely starting to scratch the surface of all this, really. So a lot of the at least in my view, a lot of the first wave of IIR emotions literature has basically made the argument that emotions matter, which is something worth saying in a field long dominated by realism and rationalists and even sort of constructivist perspectives. But we need to, for lack of a better term, go a lot deeper or look a lot more extensively at places where affect happens that we haven't seen it before, haven't looked for it before. Affective agency usually exceeds our ways of discussing agency in IIR, so I just mentioned. And my bet, or at least my claim for a lot of this stuff I'm interested in, is that affect and emotion underlies all instances of successful social construction. What do I mean by that? By successful social construction, I mean any idea that becomes hegemonic or dominant in a culture. I think affect underlies that. So we talk a lot about, especially critical security studies, we talk about ideas or discourses becoming hegemonic, war on terror becoming hegemonic in the West, so forth and so on. I think affect underlies all of that. That's the sort of provocative claim I'll throw out there here at the end, that I think because affect is probably everywhere and it's probably underlying all the things we find interesting in IIR, we need to dig more deeply into it. And if we look, I think we'll find affect and emotion underneath most of the big issues that we're interested in IIR, particularly power and agency. And with that, I think I'll end.
Thank you, Ty, nonetheless, for your absolutely excellent timekeeping, because I think we're right now, I said about 45, and I think it's like 44 right now, so it's absolutely fantastic. I would also like to add one thing to your biography, which I forgot about. As you may well be aware, we are also publishing an English language journal here in the Institute, which is called New Perspectives. And I'm happy to announce that Ty has joined us on the editorial board. So he will be also adding some of the good vibes to the affective atmosphere around the journal. Now I'll give floor to Jan to kick off the discussion and focus on some of the points that have been mentioned, and then we can proceed somewhat smoothly to a positively rhythmic, vibrant discussion, I believe.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for the paper. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's a great paper, and I completely agree that IIR actually needs to pay more attention to affect. It needs to pay much more attention to this affective atmosphere, which I think it's a particularly great concept that should be explored much more in IIR. And I think that like anyone who went to a good concert, went to a political manifestation, and so on, can only agree that this is something that matters, and it matters a lot. And I would like to see actually much more work on it in IIR, and let's say going beyond this kind of like political rallies and so on. We can speak, okay, we can do some more work on, let's say, the affective atmospheres of political negotiations and so on. And I think there is a great potential in in this concept. Well, I really like the paper, and I agree with most of your points. I would like to, let's say, point out a few things that I think that are currently missing from the paper, or that I do not completely agree with. I would probably speak a bit less from the Deleuzean perspective, much less from perspective of ontological security. I actually realized that I depart much more from literature and political mobilization, let's say collective politics. Well, first of all, affective atmospheres clearly matter, but what I really like in your paper is how it is actually created, like how does circulation actually happen, right? Like it's, I do not think, or I do not see it in let's say, especially in this empirical case, that it happens without any kind of like a conscious agency, right? that even though the Tunisian revolution has actually resonated beyond Tunis, it actually resonated because of some specific work that was done. It has resonated because of localization of specific narratives, creation of local symbols, and much of, let's say, work of the local activists who, let's say, created this kind of affective atmospheres. They do not, or I think, I would argue, they do not actually become, or they do not get started only by themselves, right? They get started by specific people who assemble the people, who do the chanting, who do the drumming, who create the slogans, and who actually create this whole context where this kind of affective atmosphere can happen. And that's something that I really like there, because when you just speak about circulation of affect, it seems to me it's kind of like that you're denying agency to lots of people who create this atmosphere, right? Yeah, let's say that this practical side is something that I really miss in the paper. Well, my second point is, let's say, connected much more to, let's say, the notion of subjectivities or identities that are created, or let's say, new subjectivities that are created by these affective atmospheres. Well, I do agree to a certain degree. Because I would say that, again, if you use very mundane examples of when you are going to some kind of sports event, right, or to musical concert, only certain types of atmospheres actually resonate with your own subjectivity, with your own identity. If I'm going to, let's say, the rally of Trump supporters, I do not think that I will connect with the proper atmosphere they want to create, right? So I do pretty much agree with the point that actually new subjectivity, that kind of like the subjectivities get changed somehow, but I do not think that like completely new subjectivities get created, right? It's much more, or in my reading and my reading of the events that you described, it's much more that it's like strengthening of the subjectivities that were already present. That people who are coming to a political rally, people that are coming to that were coming to demonstrations in Arab Spring, they were coming there with a certain well. Of course, you provided us with one example, but I do think that most of the people who went to demonstrations went there because they wanted to make a political point, right? And obviously, when they participated in the demonstration, they kind of connected with the rest of the crowd. And I was wondering during your presentation that what is actually this new subjectivity that new subjectivity, right? That gets created. This is subjectivity that's like a crowd subjectivity. It's a specific subjectivity connected to a very particular moment, or it's something that that's actually long-lasting, and that probably leads me to my last 2 points. You mentioned briefly that the question of temporality, because I would say that this I would like to hear more about the temporal dimension of these new subjectivities created by this affective atmosphere, like. Is it actually connected only to specific affect that is present in this event, or they actually do these events, do these manifestations and so on? Do they created something completely new that is long lasting, right? Or can we actually say something in like general about this, or is it very much connected to a specific case? Yeah, the question of temporality. Probably my last point is going to the data that you are using. I think it works perfectly in this paper, but I'm just wondering, like, how can we actually study affect? Can we study it through these, like, secondary sources, or do we need to study it through, let's say, ethnographic studies? And actually this points to my previous point, because how you can actually say something about the subjectivities of people who went to the manifestations based only on this, let's say, secondary data, right? It's something that is completely missing from them. So yeah, how to actually study this kind of micropolitics? Can we study them through secondary sources, or can we study them only through, let's say, participant observation or ethnographic methods, and so on? And yes, that's it probably. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. Apart from learning that you wouldn't probably resonate too much with the rally of Trump supporters, we've got some pretty important food for thought to chew upon. I'll give Ty a few minutes to respond to some of these issues, or at least to start unpacking these questions, and then I think we'll proceed to Q&A from the audience. So please, Ty.
Well, thank you for that. It's really excellent points that I have not worked through in this paper yet, but they're all points, at least a couple of them are points that I've been struggling with myself, particularly the methodological question, the last one you mentioned. How do we actually study affect? I think I don't have the answer, but this is something that IR scholars and people in cultural studies and geography are trying to tackle in various sorts of ways. So I think, I mean, for this paper, I use secondary sources, but other people they do make the case that ethnography and participant observation, going there and being part of the events themselves, is a better way of getting at it, right? So which I think there's a lot to that. If you're there at the rally or the protest or the uprising, you could speak, for lack of a better term, more directly to those kinds of experiences than if you read, as I did here, read people post hoc talking about, recalling what they experienced, right? So there's a problem there too. So the people's experiences that I'm drawing on here, they're describing what they remember feeling months ago or a year ago, right? So that's an issue I don't know the answer to, right? So is the fact that people are describing what they remembered feeling, is that how to get at affect? Because they're reconstructing what they remember they felt. Maybe what they felt at the time was not exactly what they're recalling and telling you or telling the editor of the whoever, right? So that's a huge issue, which you're definitely right to bring up. The way some people in geography are dealing with this is they're saying that affect is non-representational in the sense that it's sort of, again, it's inarticulable, it's beyond words, and so we need to do these types of performance studies or participant observation or ethnography to really get the closest we can get at it, even if we can't ultimately get to the thing in itself, if there is a thing in itself, right? So I think there's a lot to be said for that, which this paper doesn't do. That's definitely a weakness of the paper. But going forward, I really like the idea of, if I do carry something like this forward, I think ethnography is increasingly appealing to me as a way to at least get closer to what those experiences are and how they matter politically. So thanks for flagging that up. The question about temporality, I think, I didn't really unpack it in this paper, but I just wrote another paper with Brent Steele where we try to unpack, we sort of talk about a micro-political approach to international relations, where we talk about affect, space, and time in terms of three things that are usually linked in lots of different particular contexts. And we talk about time in terms of rhythm, right? So we make the case in this paper that rhythm is something political, and it's something on the everyday level that lots of people experience and that states do, that helps to kind of foster and solidify collective identities. Elections are a rhythmic thing. Every couple of years we go through the same routines of an election. In a protest, people chant things that sort of give them feelings of strength and so on. There are different forms of rhythm in everyday life that I think are political on an everyday level that we should look more at, and that there's a lot of overlap there with how people affectively experience the everyday and how their identities are generated, not just at a top-down sort of national level, but from a bottom-up everyday level. People's identities are, in a sense, generated, right? So I guess that's sort of what I mean by temporality and how I've unpacked it elsewhere. Right? So. How does circulation, that's a great point about the local activists. So how does circulation actually happen? I think that's really missing from this. So it's not, it's sort of give the impression in the paper that it's this sort of autonomous process out there that just sort of happens, but you're right, it's definitely entrepreneurs and agents and activists out there pushing all of this. It's that alongside the sort of life of its own that a circulation of affect can sort of take sometimes, but that can't be divorced from the people who generate it initially, I don't think, or keep it going. Activists always keep it going too, as you rightly pointed out. So So I think there's one more. Only certain atmospheres connect with certain people, right? So I didn't go to a Trump rally, but if I did, I probably would have a very different experience than most of the people there. So only certain atmospheres connecting with certain people in certain types of ways. I think that's probably something I gloss over in this paper, because a lot of women in Tahrir Square didn't have the same experiences as men, right? A lot of women experienced sexual assaults of various kinds in Tahrir Square and elsewhere. That they had a very different experience, and so I kind of flagged that up in passing in the paper. But that's very clear evidence that atmospheres are not uniform across individuals, right? So people have different feelings, different experiences. So if I go forward, if other people get interested in affective atmospheres, I think that's something we would have to dig more deeply into. It's a form of collective affect that links and stretches across individuals, but not in the same uniform way, obviously. Right? So I think that's an excellent point. So thanks for that. All food for thoughts.
Thank you, Ty. I'll just briefly use my prerogative as a chair to have a few short comments. First of all, affective entrepreneurs. I think this is such a buzzword that you should definitely write an article on that.
Did you coin it, or did I coin it? We can coin it together.
You can put a footnote to the IIR.
Yeah,
I could. We'd very much appreciate that, especially if it's going to be an EJIR or something like that. And the second thing, just like, I'm really glad that you mentioned the issues of methodology, because I'm also like working on something vaguely similar in my work. I'm also struggling with that. But I would actually like to say just two things to that. First of all, these questions that we ask are questions that traditional methodologies are not being asked at all. So you always ask how to measure affect, but you don't usually ask, like, what does the whole process of translating, for example, economy into GDP does, right? That's just taken for granted. So this is not necessarily, we're just asking the problems because we are dominated by particular ideas of what methodology is. And if you, for example, go into experimental methodologies, like in feminism, for example, autoethnography, emotional methodology, empathy as a methodology, cultural immersion, then I think you can get there. It's just like a different way. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, the dilemma, I think you kind of went in the direction in your response, is between the kind of, all-I waiver approach to discourse, which is basically saying, oh, I go only where I'm really sure, I'm not going to go into speculating. I'm just like going to draw the signifiers I can find. I'm not going to speculate about what people think or feel or whatsoever, because this is kind of like, that's not science. Whereby you leave quite a lot of just untouched, right? Important things are not being said. And either you can kind of like withdraw into your methodological shell and say like, well, I don't really know how to do it, so I'm not going to do it at all and pretend it doesn't exist, basically. Or, well, you're going to experiment, you're going to try and fail. And I think from my framing of this, it's pretty clear what my kind of approach to that is. Anyway, I'd love to hear some questions from the audience. If you could please identify yourself. So who does have a question, or two or three? Okay, please.
Hello, my name is Donatella. I just started my PhD in Birmingham, but I live here in Prague for now, so I'm doing distance learning. Let's see how it goes. I was thinking about what you were saying, and I was trying to, I'm dealing with populism, so a lot of things came to my mind. And I was thinking do you think maybe that collective emotions, like what role do they play in populist discourse? Usually when experts try to understand why there is such a rising support for this kind of candidates, for this kind of parties, they always talk in sort of socioeconomical dimensions. Like they talk about people who are uneducated, they talk about people who are left behind by globalization, for example. But when we go into details, we see that actually it's not always people that are uneducated, it's not always people that are not unemployed or something. So do you think that maybe it is more about collective emotions and their capacities of giving such a powerful vision of reality than just about economy and education or whatever, because usually experts, even when they talk about emotions in populist support, they always talk about anger of people who are left behind by globalization. So do you think it's a different kind of emotional perspective that might give us some explanation about this rising support?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Marcela. I think it's actually a question which goes to the heart of many of the literatures that Tsai has been drawing upon in his work. Do we have any questions so that we can, any other questions at the moment so that we can collect them, or? Okay, so, oh yeah, please. First you and then Jakub.
Hi, I'm a PhD in Geneva. I work on the Arab Spring and protest, and how protest changes from individual to collective. So actually, I'm interested in so much.
I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
I have my own idea of how protest can spread from individual to collective, and I look particularly in the on the role of visibility. But creation of collective identities is a huge part of this. So I'm wondering, in your approach, when you look at how affects people that are in this environment, how exactly do you grapple with the creation of this collective identity? How does this work? I'm sorry I didn't read your paper, I just saw this event and I don't know if it was circulated. So that's one question of how exactly does this collective identity, beyond the fact whether it lasts for a long time or just for the moment that people find themselves in. So how does this work? And two minor points on the methodology. Sure, it would be great if you're there, but if you're there, you have to grapple with the question of how much what you're interpreting is what you're feeling as opposed to what they're feeling, and that's the whole other question. So when you talk to people afterwards, of course, they're giving you a certain version of reality, and how they interpret it is post hoc, but when you're there, how do you disassociate yourself? How do you disassociate what you feel from how they feel? So I think, either way, you're not really winning, and the way feminist scholars especially are dealing with this is just the fact of positionality, right? And anthropology, and you just have to say who you are, where you're coming from, acknowledge that, and then move on. Kind of make it visible of this is my position on it, and this is how it can affect it, and this is still what I have to say. And just the larger question of, have you looked at all at studies of collective behavior? Sorry.
In what sense?
Sorry, in the sense
I have,
in the
but
sense of sorry, like the early stuff, Stelzer and Turner and Killian, kind of the precursors of social movements.
Early social movement stuff. I'm aware of some of that, but as far as this paper, no, I didn't delve into it. But if I take it forward, I'm well aware that there's a bunch of a world of social movement stuff that I need to tackle.
It's actually like the pre-social movements, where they look more at how just crowds. It's mostly study of crowds. How crowds have an effect that is really more like temporal and changing, going beyond the individuals. And in terms of temporality, that only lasts for as long as you're in the crowd. So that's the only reason why I'm bringing it up. And I know there's the Turner and Killian, there's Smelser, and I think most of them are kind of 1950s stuff. And then social movements are a reaction to these studies, saying it's not just something that happens effectively with an affect, but actually something people do strategically. And there is a whole other turn, and that's social movements. So from what I've seen that you're doing is actually going back to that, which is super interesting, and I feel this is how things work. Once we go too much in one direction, then there is a bit of a reaction and swing back. And,
Thank you for that. I didn't get your name first, I'm not sure.
Sorry. My name is Zuzana Hulekova.
Okay, thank you, Zuzana. I suggest, because this was quite a rich contribution, that we wait for Jakub for another round and that you tackle these questions at the moment. Yes.
So, well, thanks for those. Both really excellent questions. So the question on populism, I would totally agree with you. I think that populism, from what I've read about populism, that most of it does sort of like the social movements literature. It takes the grievances, political, economic, social, racial, what have you, as the main primary motivators of why people calculate that this is the best way to get what they want to participate in protests, right? So I think, so I go to Ernesto Laclau's book on populism, his last book he wrote before he died, and so Ernesto Laclau moved it. He basically says, he wrote a book on this, and he says, well, if you look at the way we usually look at populism, it does come from these perspectives, but it doesn't take into account the sheer visceral element that motivates people or pushes people over the top when their rational calculations doesn't lead them in any particular direction. So affect is that extra push that generates a lot of the movement that we see. So for him, affect is a part of the collective discourse of populism. So if you take someone like Trump, so I think Laclau would look at Trump and say something like, well, if you look at his signifiers, his discourse, make America great again, it says nothing, right? It says, it's vague, it's ambiguous, effectively says nothing, but there's just enough of a narrative there that lots of different kinds of people can basically fill that in with whatever they want, right? Which is how Trump evidently got lots of different constituencies that we weren't expecting him to get. So it was just vague and ambiguous enough that people could basically read into it what they wanted, and for Laclau, that's the affective sort of element. People fill in these empty signifiers with their own subjectivities, and that's the affective tie into the broader collective discourses. So I sort of take his view on that. I think that we should talk more about affect in collective movements like populism. I just saw there's a book out at Stanford Press, someone looking at populism in terms of performance and ritual. I haven't read it yet, but I just ran across it like yesterday. So maybe more people are starting to look at populism in these terms. I think we should, because it's overlooked. I think it's not just epiphenomenal. I think it's causal in some sense. It's doing some work in addition to things that we normally look at with populism, with the grievances and so forth. Right? So thanks for that. The question on, or multiple questions on, so how does identity work? And the question of basically methodology and crowds, right? So the crowd stuff, I've dipped into this a little bit, and I guess maybe I'm closer to that stuff than I am the more recent social movements stuff. The more recent social movements literature, from what I gather, is fairly rationalist in how it pictures people's motivations, right? So there's an article in Perspectives by Wendy Perlman 2 years ago, in Perspectives on Politics, where she talks about emotions as micro foundations of the Arab Spring, but she takes a very individualist approach to emotions, and she says, well, people aren't just rational calculators, they have emotions too, and the emotions are what pushes them over the edge when rational calculations are indeterminate, right? That's probably fair enough, but I think there's something else, there's a collective dimension there that she doesn't get and that rationalist scholars also don't get, or at least they overlook. And that's not to say that people don't rationally calculate sometimes, of course they do, but those times that there's something else going on, I think it's that collective element. I think maybe in some way it is closer to the crowd stuff, and even go back further to Gustave Le Bon and some of these other very earlier studies that sort of now quasi-infamous 19th century studies who looked at crowds as sort of mass hysteria and sort of the irrational masses. I'm not taking that approach, it's very essentialist and all the rest, but in terms of how they try to grapple with the collective affective dimensions, I think maybe there's something there we could swing the pendulum back to and look at that the rationalist wave sort of overlooked. So that's actually something I'm looking at right now, actually. So thanks for the extra push in that direction. The methods question, and you're right to bring up feminism, right? So I didn't mention it here, but all the emotions scholars in IIR owe a lot to feminists and gender scholars because they were at the forefront, they have been at the forefront of all this stuff, and they've been talking about emotions for a long time, and the emotions literature in IIR really hasn't given them their due for how much work they've been doing the last 25 or 30 years or so. So that said, I think the feminist position, like you mentioned, is probably the best we can do. So acknowledge where we sit and just be upfront about it and move on from there. Because if we, I mean, I can read secondhand accounts of how people say they remember how they experienced something that has its problems, but I think it gets at something that the other literatures miss. But as you say, sitting there in the middle of the crowd, you're gonna, I mean, that's a perspective also. So we can't get away from perspectives, I don't think. So it's, and yeah, I think just being upfront with our methodological choices and what they get us and what they don't get us, I think is the best way forward. Yeah. How does, and the final point, how does collective identity work? I think it works on multiple levels and multiple registers, right? So the way we usually think about collective identity in international relations is in terms of collective or corporate actors seeing another as not themselves. As we know the argument, I think David Campbell's sort of argument, right? So, and we usually look at that through discourses, elite discourses, good and evil, us and them, foreign domestic, so forth and so on. But we should keep looking at that, but I think that's mixed in and overlays a whole register of everyday affective experiences that we don't use, a sort of, for lack of a better term, bottom-up experiences generated and just top-down elite discourses that we usually look at. So the way collective identity works is some sort of messy combination between discourses that elites projected us from the top down, so to speak, but also the various and differential ways that people experience those on the ground, because people don't experience, Americans didn't experience the war on terror in the same way, right? We all got the same discourse from the Bush administration, but it played out very differently on the ground depending on who you were, and where you sat, and color your skin was, and all the rest. And so I think it's somewhere in between elite and top-down and bottom-up approaches, for lack of a better term. Just sort of on this, Andrew Ross and Todd Hull had an article in International Organization last year, which is really good, how they talk about collective affect as 3 interlinked processes between top-down processes from elites, horizontal processes across states and societies, and bottom-up processes on an everyday micro-political register. So they do a really good job of explaining. I think they would say collective identity works at the nexus of those 3 Venn diagrams or levels, if you will. So at least right now, this is sort of how I'm thinking about collective identity. But
so you don't look at solidarity?
Solidarity.
Like creating, whether the affective creates a feeling of solidarity.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, so I mean, collective identity probably is in some sense another way of talking about a sense of solidarity, probably. I think so.
Thank you for that. I know that Jan wanted to intervene briefly, then I'll hand on to Jakub and other questions you may have.
I just wanted to defend probably a social movement theory a bit, because there is actually quite some research in immersion and contemporary social movement.
There is.
You look on, I don't know, people like James Jaspers, who is actually working specifically on this. So I wouldn't say that it's only rationalistic. I would say it's quite a movement in direction of immersions and social movements.
Yeah, I mean, I was glossing a lot of that, but I'm working through Jasper stuff right now. But even so, I think I have particular beefs with Jasper, which might be another paper. But there are folks that talk about emotion, but I think there are other ways to talk about it that gets us more at the experiences that are other experiences that are ignored in other ways of looking at it, I guess. But
okay, I just won't say it's
definitely worth bringing up Jasper. Yeah.
Okay, we have Jakub. Do we have any other questions? Can you just indicate if you have any other questions? Okay, so Jakub and I have like 1 or 2 of my own after that.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, and I'm very sorry that I missed the beginning, for which I apologize. And it actually kind of clarified for me what the affective turn is about in IR. So my name is Jakub Eberle. I'm doing a PhD here in Prague in IR, and in my PhD I'm looking into the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and I'm looking into normalization or concealment of violence, basically. And I was actually started just a brief note about the methodology. I kind of started with semi-ethnography, and I ended up doing auto-ethnography, basically. So I very much can recommend it. My question actually, and it relates to your final point, and also to what Jan was asking, is about the power and power/agency behind the affect. You know, and you said like, or I quote your slide here, affects emotion analyze all instances of successful social constructs. But then, you know, you got to like, and then you talk about that piece in IIR International Organization, which I'm not familiar with, but you kind of sketched out there's like this 3-layer process basically. But then, you know, when you talk about the war on terror, right, then it's clear that the war on terror resonated for like several reasons, like the whole notion about the US exceptionalism, but also the fact that the government, like the administration, was in position in which they could like impose, or like that would be my misunderstanding perhaps of how affect can work politically. So basically the question is, you know, what is the potential for like resistance when it comes to affect? Because yeah, you said like we were talking about solidarity, but like solidarity by, well, that's very basic sociological insight, is like relational, and it serves to exclude some people, and like yeah, the Trump couldn't be more illustrative in this regard. So yeah, if you, I mean yeah, I gather that it's something that you are just thinking about, but if you could kind of like sketch out if you thought about these issues of resistance and hegemony in more detailed manner.
So we have a issue of resistance. I'll add 1 or 2 questions of my own, then you can have some more time to answer them. My questions relate, both of them, more to the basis of your claims in their situation in the literature. First of them would be, I'm not quite clear of what is it that you're doing to the ontological security literature, because
dissolving it.
Yeah, because that's the point here, right? Because from what you're saying, you're challenging so many of the claims of, like, you know, the kind of standard Gidensian ontological security literature. So is this about making it better? Is it about killing it off, or what is that? That's the first question. And the other one is like, I mean, I'm very much on board of the argument, apart from some philosophical nuances, let's say. But like, you know, you ended up on that claim that, you know, affect emotion underlies all instances of successful social constructs. Isn't this basic Freud, basically saying that libido is what holds the social bonds together? Do we need the sword through the 1,000 plateaus and all of that? If we do, what does it bring on top of this? And please, now back to
write this down before I didn't think I'd be writing down collective libido here, but here I am writing it down. That's a great one. Potential for resistance. So the first thing that came to mind as you were talking was the old critiques of Foucault, right? So if power is everywhere, how do you resist it? And so this is sort of the Foucault-Habermas debate, and sort of lots of critiques of Foucault. And you can make this, if you're not careful, you can make the same critique of, you can make the same argument, but then critique of affect. So if affect is everywhere, then it's nowhere, then how do we use it to explain anything if it's sort of a constant or a background? And how do you explain its potential, if there is potential for resistance, where do you get that? Or where does that come from? I mean, I think the first answer is that just no discourse and no affect is ever totalized, right? So the social, so coming from a post-structuralist perspective, the social is ongoing, right? It's incomplete, it's not fixed, there's no grounds on which, there's no real life to which our social constructs hook into, and so therefore just the fact of that the social is an ongoing, incomplete social construct means that there's always cracks in social formations. And it's those cracks that are always there, they might be hidden, they might be silent, they might be unspoken, we might forget about them, but they're always there, and it takes activists and entrepreneurs and people sort of occupying those cracks to widen them up for us. So I guess from my sort of post-structuralist perspective, that's where the resistance comes from. The fact is,
I was wondering about yourself, basically, you know, if you have kind of thought where you stand on this debate.
Yeah, that would be my position. There's always potential there for resistance because the social is always ongoing, right? There's no fixed or closed totality ultimately. So even if the war on terror seemed at the time like this dominant hegemonic thing, it never really was. People made jokes about it, right? Not everyone bought into it. Same with neoliberalism, right? So neoliberalism seems to be the only game in town, so to speak, but there's increasing critiques of that. And so starting from that post-structuralist position, you can get to and show how there's always cracks in the social that can lead to that. I guess that would be my answer anyway. So, what am I doing to ontological security? That I got this question from Katerina Kinval, who's putting together the special issue to which I submitted this paper. My answer is I really like how ontological security is able to get at things the identity literature in IIR doesn't seem to talk about, number one. So ontological security folks talk about security in ways that we didn't quite get with the identity literature, number one, and we seem to be able to talk more about affects with ontological security than we always did with identity. Right? So I never got much affect. I wasn't looking for it at the time, but we never got much affect from Roxanne Doty or David Campbell or Lena Hansen or Rob Walker. Right? Those folks' work is tremendous, and it's because of them that we can all sort of talk about these things. But we seem to, when we talk about ontological security or security of the self, we get to talk about things, or things creep into our discussion such as anxiety, stress, fear of in different registers and different types. And so one of the things I like about ontological security is it gets us talking about affects in different sorts of ways. That said, I've sort of convinced myself lately, at least, that we're too focused on actors in international relations, and we need to look at sort of things that exceed subjects, right? So this is, again, coming from a sort of post-structuralist position, to focus on structures rather than agents, right? I've sort of convinced myself that I'm watching this the last 48 hours, what's happened in the US, that all this collective stuff matters, oftentimes more than any individual subject. So the things that exceed individual subjects, these collective phenomena, I think ontological security, and by implication other literatures in IIR should pay more attention to. So I'm not trying to demolish ontological security, I don't think, but I'm just trying to get it to look at things that are overlooked by most of other IIR scholars too. So it's a very long-winded and vague answer to your question. But oh, Freud, yeah. I didn't think Freud would come up here, but if we're doing Lacan, we might as well talk about Freud. So how is this different from collective libido? Freud had a very 19th century biological, mechanical, hydrological view of the human body and the psyche. Right? So if you've ever read Freud, he's all about pressures and sort of things happening in the body, which is very sort of 19th century view of things. And so it's very essentialized. Right? So Freud was a rich Victorian white guy at a particular place, particular time, who was wrong about a lot of things, but his notion of collective libido, I guess, would be an early precursor, early essentialized precursor to the things I want to talk about. So I like to think that the stuff I'm talking about is not essentialist, but I'm standing on Freud's Victorian shoulders and moving past Freud in that sense. So that's my vague answer to that one.
So yeah, it's a vague answer, but you managed to take us from the Victorian to Trumpian times in like 3 sentences. So I think it's pretty much a success. Before we wrap up, I have an announcement to make. It is an invitation for next week, because next week on Tuesday we'll be having 2 events here. One of them held in English and organized by the Center for International Law, the Institute Center for International Law. It's called The Use of Force Against the Islamic State, and will feature our researchers Veronika Bílková and Tamáš Latman, together with Petr Dytrichová from the Ministry of Defense, and will take place from 5. Even before that, on the same day, we will have an event in Czech on energy terrorism and energy as a weapon, as a tool of terrorist organizations in the Middle East and the implications for the Czech Republic. A presentation of a project by our research fellow Lukáš Tichý. You can check it all on our website and our Facebook page. I would also like to highlight, because we had some really interesting questions and discussions, that if you have a paper in preparation, a certain journal may be really interested in your submissions. And apart from that, I would very much like Ty to for his really interesting discussion, and as well as the presentation beforehand, as well as Jan and all of you for asking your fantastic questions. And yeah, I'm wishing you a very nice rest of the evening. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.